Hello everyone, my name is Bostonis. I'm the Business Development Manager at IMechE and I'm going to be moderating this webinar. It's 12:30, so we're going to make a start. Thank you for all those who have joined us today and all those who have added their names and where they are today in the chat box. Very kind of you to do that. Today we are going to be delivering the Presenting and Public Speaking, Getting Your Message Across webinar. So we're delivered by my colleague Andy Webber. There's a lovely picture of himself and myself there for you to see. The webinar will last approximately an hour. It's being recorded. There will be a link in the chat box to be able to access the recording in about a week's time, once we've edited it and made it available for you guys. We do a number of these webinars throughout the year. All of them are free of charge, and all the recordings are available via our website. So if you go onto the website, go into the training section on the website and scroll down, you'll see the free webinar section. So if you have any colleagues or anyone you feel might be interested in any of the topics that we covered, by all means point them in that direction. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Andy, who is going to deliver the webinar. Any questions that you have, by all means, please type them into the text box down the bottom. Make them to all participants, and what we'll do, Andy will either answer them as we go along or we'll collate a few and answer them at the end. Andy.
Hi Rob, hi everybody, thank you very much indeed. Rob, you need to pass me the ball so I can change the slides now, thank you very much. Great to see so many of you from all over the world actually, I can see. Heather, if you could say hi to my sister who also lives in Lincoln, I'd be grateful when you see her. So I'm Andy, I'm a principal consultant with the institution, and I am here today to talk to you about presenting and public speaking. When I was talking to a friend of mine the other day and explaining that that's what I was going to be doing today, and their response was, "Oh God, I could never do that." And it made me think a little bit. Why is it that we find speaking to groups of people in either some kind of speech or a presentation so nerve-wracking? It's not like we're unable to talk, and indeed it's not like we're unable to talk to groups of people. It's something we do all the time, and yet when it comes to actually presenting, we find this fear from somewhere. So delete that idea that you could never do that. You can do that. We can all do that. We can all speak. And hopefully today I'm going to give you some ideas about how to go about structuring a presentation, have a brief discussion on delivery. Of course, it's a little bit difficult to talk about delivery. It's quite personal. You know, what each of us needs to learn to do differently, what we could each develop is slightly different, and you're better off finding that out from others with a bit of feedback. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then later on in the session, we're going to look at how to perhaps add some interest, make your presentations more interesting. And then finally, I want to look at a couple of the great speeches and look at some of the things that those speakers did to get their message across more effectively. But to start, I would like to get you to participate a little bit, and I'm going to do that by means of a poll, and hopefully Rachel, who is supporting us technically here, will get the poll ready for you to respond to. And simply I would like you to indicate how much experience you have with presenting. I can't see a poll at the moment, although it should be appearing soon, I hope. Here it is. So if you could just click and then submit. So you click in the radio button and then submit bottom right, and we will see what sort of levels of experience we have in the group. It takes a little bit of time for the cogs to turn and the answers to be displayed, and we have no answer. 116 is the winner. I'm not sure if you were too slow or just didn't understand the question. But it looks like pretty infrequently, only 9 out of 260 several times a week, and a couple of times a month. So it's probably the single thing that you can do that will most improve your presenting is practice. But let's start at the beginning, and let's look at structure and how to structure a presentation. And I'm going to focus on a presentation for this part rather than a speech. We'll investigate briefly the difference between a talk and a presentation a little bit later, what the difference is. And the simple structure for actually any presentation or speech is a sandwich structure. Presentations, generally speaking, would recommend in perhaps a 15-20 minute presentation these sorts of percentages. So the main messages are all going to be contained within the body, and you're going to spend the greater percentage of your time on those parts. But you do need to top and tail it with an opening and a close, and you see this structure around you all the time. On the news, for example, you have the news headlines, they tell you about the actual stories, and then they'll have some kind of little summary at the end. What changes between a presentation and perhaps a speech is the percentages. So the longer the talk, the smaller the percentage of the opening. It probably remains the same number of minutes. So again, working to a 20-minute presentation, you've probably got 3 or 4 minutes for an opening in a 20-minute presentation, and you probably only have 3 or 4 minutes in an hour-long speech as well. So it changes. The percentage changes rather than the minutes changing. So once you have your structure, once you have this basic structure, you need to really think about the body, and that's where the main messages of the presentation are contained. And it's useful when you're developing your presentation to think about it in terms of major and minor points. Again, working to a 20-minute presentation, we would say that broadly speaking, you'll probably need 3 to 5 major points. Within those major points, they're sort of the headlines, the major piece of the presentation. And within those major points, the minor points are what you're actually going to say about that particular thing. Using this kind of mind map technique is a really good way of gathering the content for your presentation, because it almost structures your presentation for you as you go, and it also particularly helpful in helping you to see the links between the different points that you're going to make, because as we'll see in a second, that's very important to making the presentation flow. So if you look at this, again, 2 to 5 minor points per major point. Obviously that depends how many major points you have. If you work to around something like 15 minor points in total, again, if you go back to this 20-minute presentation and 70% of your time on the body, that gives you about a minute per minor point. If you've got many more minor points than that, you're going to be struggling to really do them justice. So this kind of balance is what we're looking for in a presentation. Just to give you an example, this is exactly the approach I took when I was preparing today's talk, today's webinar. And so you can see the 4 major points that were the 4 things that I included in the agenda, although the 4th one there, rhetoric in action, that's what I actually called it when I was putting the presentation together. And I changed that for the agenda item, but essentially those 4 major points are the 4 points that I covered in the agenda. And you can see how the structure of the minor points from, sorry, the major point structure is broken down into minor points. Gosh, there's too many similar words in this. And we started with a sandwich. We've then been talking about major and minor points, and you can see that we're going to go on to flow and then presentations versus speeches. So when you're putting together a presentation, as I said, it's important to think about the structure. It's important to structure it in terms of these major and minor points. And once you have those major and minor points, as you can see from this slide, you need to think about the flow. And there are 2 important parts to making a presentation flow. They are thinking about the sequence, i.e. what order are you going to talk about the major points in, and how do you get from one major point to the next. Sometimes this is obvious, sometimes it's not so clear, but it is important to put some thought into it, because this is what makes a presentation easy to follow for the audience. And when you're both putting together a presentation and delivering a presentation, that's crucial. You need to be thinking about the audience experience throughout. I spent many years working with engineers. Personally, I'm not an engineer myself, but I spent the last 20 years working with engineers on workshops, leadership workshops, for example, but also presentation skills workshops. And the challenge an engineer often has with a presentation is the fact that the audience is not as technically competent as they are. So it's about getting a complex engineering message across to a non-technical audience, which requires even more thought into how you're going to make this presentation flow and what the needs of that audience are. So when it comes to sequencing, sometimes it's very obvious what kind of sequence you need to cover your major points in. Most obviously, if there's some kind of journey, either a geographical journey or perhaps a chronological journey, story in time, they're the most obvious sequences that you can use. But it's not always that obvious, and again, particularly when you're talking about an engineering topic, it may well not be that simple. So you can see from the screen there are a few ideas here. If anyone's got any other ideas, feel free to type them in the chat box. I'll see if I can pick up on them. If anyone's got any alternative ideas. I used a version of complexity for today's session. I don't know if you remember the agenda items, but I started with structure and then going on to delivery. So if you think about it, that's kind of the order that you do a presentation, or you prepare a presentation and then you deliver a presentation in. Put it together and then deliver it. But then we're going back a little bit to thinking about adding interest, which is more of a structural thing than a delivery thing, although it also manifests itself in the delivery. So it's sort of logical, and then it's sort of complexity as well. Significance, Siobhan, yeah, that's it. Significance to the audience, I would say, is the important thing. And I agree, similar to complexity, but sometimes as I said, it's not always obvious the right way to sequence your presentation, and it can actually be quite challenging to think about what is the right order here. But it is very important, and try and think about it again, as I repeat myself a little bit, but I make no apology because it's so important. Think about it from the perspective of your audience rather than your own perspective. So once you've got your sequence, once you've decided which order you're going to cover the major points in, you then need to think about how you're going to get from one major point to the other, and that is by means of transitions. Now, if I can just pause my presentation or my talk for a second, what I just said was an example of a transition. I can just go back a slide. 2 points about this. First, it's the way in which you move from one idea to the next. Okay, it's not that different to get from sequencing to transitions, but it's still important to make it flow. I could have done this. So that's the sequencing. Next, we need to talk about transitions, which is slightly less smooth. And the key part about this, when you're transitioning from one slide to the next, is to make the transition at the end of this slide rather than at the beginning of this slide. It makes it clear to your audience that you know what slide is coming next, and it's just a bit smoother in the transition. So when you're thinking about transitions, you can use sort of generic transitions that you can see on the slide here, but it's better to think of presentation-specific transitions. And in particular, at the bottom there, a little image of a signpost. Signposting is both very useful for the audience and a useful transition. You can't use it every slide, of course, but it's about helping the audience follow the map of your presentation. And it's almost like a little summary. You summarize where we've been, you say where we are, and then you go on to talk about what's coming next. So, by way of an example, I might at this moment say, so up until this point we've been considering the structure of a presentation and how to make it flow. Next, I just want to think about the differences between a presentation and a speech. And there's your transition signpost. So, ideas in the chat box. What are the differences and or similarities between presentations and speeches? In my mind there are differences, but actually it's quite difficult to pin them down. And when I was preparing the next slide, which is a table of a summary of some of the differences, I was realizing that they're not hard and fast rules, they're tendencies rather than facts. Comment from Mike. So I missed that earlier on, Mike. Rob has just prodded me. Is there a commercial sequence? Yeah, commercial, yes. I think I understand that. But and again, a bit like Siobhan was saying, it's almost a combination of some of the other sequences. So how do we look? We've got speeches look and sound as scripted. Yeah. Speech is rhetorical, lecturing on an idea and a topic. Yeah, lecture is a word that a lecture is a form of speech. Less content to refer to with speech. Yeah, I'd agree with that, Tyler. There's usually less, things to take away that people need to remember. It's usually more of a feeling that they're going away with. Stuart, definitely more visuals usually with a presentation. Again, there are some exceptions to that rule. Audience more passive in a speech, Paul, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Presentations of technical speeches are general. I think that's generally true that certainly speeches are not technical usually. Speeches more associated with ideology, presentations more transfer of information. Yeah. Repeat the main points, Nick, with a speech. Yeah. And there's also, generally speaking, fewer main points. There's one sort of big thing often in a speech. Not always, again, but often. Good. Thank you for those ideas. This is my summary of some of the key differences. And again, just to repeat, they're tendencies. You'll be able to think of exceptions to the rule for all of these. But speeches tend to be to more people. Simply, the audience tends to be bigger, and as a consequence, there tends to be less audience interaction than there is with a presentation. Talked about slides and the lack of them in a speech. I put topic versus cause here. Often a speech is more about a cause. Several of you mentioned technical information or more of a topic in a presentation and more sort of key points in a topic, that information to go away with. whereas with a speech it's more of a feeling that you're trying to engender. And that feeling is often to motivate or inspire people, rally them to a cause, rather than give someone information in a presentation. There's a sort of a hybrid between the two, and I was thinking about this. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with TED Talks, but they're almost like a hybrid. They're definitely more of a lecture than a presentation, but they will have slides. They've got larger numbers of people, but they're usually on a topic. There's probably less audience interaction, or there might be a little bit. So they're really a hybrid, and you can think of talks and lectures as sort of somewhere between presentations and speeches. But in essence, I would say that this is a bit of an academic debate, because fundamentally what's important here is how do we structure a presentation versus a speech. And whilst there are slight differences, broadly similarities are greater. In a speech you still have a beginning, middle and end, although the percentages change. As I said earlier on, it's probably 90 to 95% body in a speech, simply because speeches are usually longer. There's also this idea of, in a speech, that you can also translate to a presentation. Now, this is a TED Talk called The Secret Structure of Great Talks by Nancy Duarte. And she talks about, she analysed a number of great speeches, and she began to notice a pattern in them. And they very often begin with the current situation, where are we now, and then go on to compare that to what might be in the future. And this is usually where we want to go, or where the speaker wants us to go. What she then noticed is that very simple comparison, contrast, is repeated over and over and over. So we go back to the current situation, which is usually dark and gloomy and grim, and then back on to where we might be in the future, which is bright and fluffy, etc., etc. And this pattern is repeated throughout great talks, and it's a very simple way of inspiring people to try to move to the what could be. Now, this is, again, to repeat, this is the structure she observed in some of the great talks, but it's also a structure that we can apply in a presentation context. So comparison and contrast is important, and I'll come to that again in a second. Just to pick up on one comment in the chat box, TED, George. TED is it's a series of talks that are recorded. They're delivered live and videoed. So if you type in TED Talks to Google, or other search engines are available, then they're very, very interesting. There are many, many, many different types of TED Talks on all kinds of topics: leadership, presentation skills, speeches, and you can learn a lot from them. They're fascinating, and ranging from very technical to much broader, more general type topics. And they're all, good point, Christopher. They're all around. I think it's 18 minutes actually. I think that's the limit. They're very strict apparently on the limit for the TED Talks. Sometimes they're shorter. So, to summarise this part of the presentation, the structure, your key here relates back to the audience. It's fundamentally about their experience. And what makes a presentation or a talk interesting for an audience is obviously relevant information. I think that goes without saying. But being able to follow where we are. So understanding where we've been, where we are and what's coming next, using signposting is a very good way to do that. But also making sure that don't try and dazzle the audience with complexity, because they'll be lost. As a participant in a presentation, as an audience member, you don't have all the structure and the slides in your head. You don't know what's coming. So actually making it flow, logical sequence, and making things simple for them is what you're after. And I think it's probably the thing that I see the most in engineers is that we have a tendency to want to sound intelligent by going into too much complexity. One of my favourite quotes from Einstein is this one. I'm not going to say it. That's one of the rules about presenting, by the way. Don't say the words on the screen. You can do it with you can do it with a quote. But this idea that actually, if you're going to be able to explain it simply to your audience, that requires you to really truly understand it properly, which is a really nice idea. So, a little bit more interaction, I think, get you to participate a little bit more in this with another poll. I want to talk about delivery a little bit, and as I said at the beginning, this is difficult to do in a webinar setting because each one of you will have different tendencies when you deliver, and it's really I can't encourage you enough to go on a presentation skills course. It doesn't have to be one of ours, although obviously ours are the best. But do go on a course where you have the opportunity to deliver a presentation and get some feedback from someone who is trained in observing and observing presentation skills. It's really a rich learning experience. It's uncomfortable, it's difficult, it's embarrassing, it's nerve-wracking, but fundamentally it's an incredibly powerful way to learn. So, as I promised, another poll. I'd like you to just indicate to me, by means of this poll, how nervous you feel when you present or when you're speaking in public. And I'm hoping my technical expert Rachel is on this case. Excellent. So again, click on the little circle and then press submit in the bottom right hand corner, and the time is up. Gavin, depends how much you prepared, which is one of the key points that I'm going to make in a second. It's how quite often one of my favourite answers to someone when I asked how much time do you spend preparing for a presentation, their response was, it depends how long the flight is, which is not the right answer. Okay, so somewhat or very nervous is by far the most popular, not very, and not at all, only 4 out of 300. Very interesting. So it's a funny thing, isn't it? I genuinely think it's strange. I do this for a job every morning, well, not quite every morning, but many mornings I get up and I meet a new group of people and I stand up and talk to them and work with them in a workshop setting for a day. Now, I've been doing that for so many years that I no longer get nervous about that really at all. But change the parameters even slightly, and I do get nervous. If I imagine giving some kind of TED talk type thing, I would be nervous. But give me slides and a presentation to deliver, that's slightly different from what I normally do. And that just makes me tense, I think is not quite the right word, but slightly more self-aware. Today, I feel not quite as comfortable as I normally do, just because this isn't what I normally do. And what I normally do is the key phrase here. One of the key things you can do is practice, which I'll come to in a second. But what are the ways in which we communicate? And really, you only have 3 things that you use when you're trying to get a message across in any communication context, assuming you're face-to-face. You have the words themselves, of course. The way you say the words is important. You can add sarcasm and it completely changes the meaning to a sentence. for example. And then you have body language, of course, only if you're face-to-face. And when we're presenting and when we're nervous, we tend to develop tics and habits in any one of those three things. Mainly the words and the body language, but you do also get a few habits and tics in the tone as well. The interesting thing about tics and habits, tics being verbal tics. So an example of a verbal tic would be umming and erring, for example, using a, there was a nice for you, using a phrase or word repeatedly. There are social tendencies with verbal tics. Literally is one of the verbal tics of the moment. Kind of, to be honest, are very common ones right now, all of which frustrate me. The interesting thing about verbal tics and habits is that we all have them when we're not nervous, when we're just chatting to our friends in a restaurant or around a cup of tea or something. What tends to happen when we get nervous is they're exaggerated. So we tend to, they're sort of like comfort blankets. We tend to use them more. So one of the things that I can recommend to you in order to develop your competence in presenting is try to spot your own verbal tics and habits in day-to-day life. Just when you're talking to others, maybe ask someone, see if you can identify what they are, because they'll almost certainly increase when you start to present. So mine, when I very first started to present, were umming and erring. Now I and err a little bit day to day, but when I first started to present, it really became almost a distraction for the audience. I think some people would definitely have noticed. It was enough to be a distraction. So I had to work hard to try to remove that. Interestingly, when I talk on the phone, it also increases. And when I deliver webinars and online sessions, it also increases. So throughout this session, I've been very conscious of avoiding umming and erring. I'll be interested when I listen back to it, if I do, to know how much I have. I don't think I've done it that much, but you might, if you do listen back, you might be able to spot tiny little gaps. You may even have noticed them already, where I would have ummed and erred if I hadn't caught myself. And that's the way it works. You almost remove one problem and create another. It does get more fluid as you go along, and I hope I would have put one there if I hadn't been thinking about it. You start to get a little bit more conscious and it starts to get a little bit more natural. So identifying your tics and habits, and similarly body language tics and habits will also increase and develop when you are presenting. They are less obvious in day-to-day life though, because you're less likely to be standing when you're talking to someone. Usually it's the verbal tics and habits you can identify day-to-day life, and body language habits you probably need to actually make presentations and get some feedback from someone. Probably the single biggest thing that you can do to develop your presentation skills, other than just focusing on being passionate. Passion kills nerves in two ways. Number one, if you think about how passionate you are about your subject, about how much you want to get your message across, you'll forget to be nervous. Sounds strange, but the passion that you feel for a topic or a subject will help you to reduce your own nervousness in the first place. Equally, from the audience point of view, as you show your passion, as you feel passionate, people will start to notice that and forget to notice your nervousness. So passion can really kill nerves in two ways. So even, I know it's difficult sometimes to be passionate about a topic that perhaps isn't so interesting if you're presenting, but still think about being passionate about some part of that message will help you to deliver the message. Right. If anybody gets the answer to this, I will be astonished. Sorry about the sound, I've just noticed the chat. I've turned it off so I wasn't distracted by the comments. But I'm glad to see you haven't noticed, Siobhan. If anyone gets the answer to this right, I really will be amazed. Does anyone know who this person is? Good guess, George. And right, and Chris, right, right era and right nation. This is a gentleman called Demosthenes. He's less well known than some of the gentlemen that you have suggested. Demosthenes was born in 384 BC. He was the son of a wealthy swordmaker, and sadly he was orphaned aged 7. He was frustrated with his guardians, and when he became a teenager, he decided he wanted to take his guardians to court about the misappropriation of his inheritance. And the way things worked back then is that you represented yourself, and he felt that he needed to learn rhetoric in order to take his guardians to court. He did so, and in fact, I think he was successful in his case against his guardians. But this pricked his interest, and he decided to become an orator. Now, the orators in ancient Greece were the rock stars of the day, and he made a speech, and he was heavily criticised for it. Plutarch said, and I quote, "He was inarticulate and stammering in his pronunciation." So poor Demosthenes was devastated by this, and he decided to go home. He built a cellar. He shaved half his head to prevent himself from being able to go out, and spent 3 months practicing his oration skills in front of a polished shield. And the fact that there's a bust of him in the British Museum would suggest to you probably already that he became quite a famous orator simply through practice. And it is the single biggest thing that you can do for yourself, other than getting feedback from somebody else. But if you're delivering a presentation, if you've got a presentation to deliver, practice it. If you know what you're going to say, if you know what's coming next, I know from experience the fear that I have when I'm not quite sure what the next slide is, versus I know what the next slide is. That is a huge difference in terms of the confidence that you feel in yourself and the way in which you're able, therefore, to deliver the message. So, practice and get some feedback. 3 months, yeah. I perhaps wouldn't suggest shaving half your head, but practice. Okay. So we've talked about structure. We've talked about delivery. I now want to think about. Oh, damn it! Clearly, I didn't know my slides well enough. This whole saying is actually not really true. Practice makes perfect. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes it permanent. So if you practice the wrong thing, you'll ingrain a habit, develop a habit of the wrong thing. Those of you that play musical instruments, I dabble with the guitar. And if I practice something over and over and over, but actually I was practicing it wrong, it's really quite difficult to change that. I also play golf. You get into a habit with your golf swing, it's really very difficult to change that. So practicing doing something over and over again makes it permanent through what we call muscle memory. But permanent, so make sure you're practicing the right things. Robotic, Johnny, that's a good question. And when you're practicing, avoid a script. When you're delivering a presentation, scripting it is a bad idea, I believe, because you will end up, even if you're not reading from the script, it'll sound like you're reading from the script, unless you're a very good actor. Obviously, actors repeat the lines that they have been given, and they do that in a really effective way. It's much better to have bullet points. So practice enough to know what your bullet points are, and then talk around the bullet points. It's a shame I don't have a webcam. I could show you what I have on the wall in front of me, so that, which is just I would guess it's probably 20 bullet points in case I lose my place, so that I can just glance up at the wall, work out where I am, and then go back to speaking about the bullet. But I don't have specific words that I want to say around the bullet point. I clearly missed this bullet point because I missed those two slides. What I wanted to move on to, though, was thinking about adding interest. So there's lots of different ways of adding interest to a presentation. Again, if you'd like to make some suggestions in the chat box. Sorry, I'm just going to pause my thought. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce your name. Ramon, I think. Apologies if that's wrong. Scripting a presentation can help to reduce the level of nervousness because it gives you more confidence in delivering the content. Ramon, I find the opposite. Now, we're all different, first of all, so if that works for you, then that's great. But if I have a script, I then feel under pressure to remember each word in the script. And if I get a word wrong, then that can throw me. Bullet points work for me because, number one, there's less to remember, and I'm frankly lazy. I can remember a series of bullet points, and I know my topic well enough to be able to talk within the context of the bullet point. And I don't have words that I then have to remember, which throw me when I forget them, if that makes sense. Nonetheless, I absolutely recognise that we're all different, and so it's important to do what works for you. Great. I love the comments that you started to type in, and there's many of them that I can't pick up on them all. But thank you so much for contributing. There are a few examples here. Many of you mentioned some sort of interaction involving the audience. Now, it depends on the audience. You can ask questions which you actually want an answer to. You can even ask a rhetorical question, a question which you don't really want anybody to actively answer. The way that works is that that's simply the audience will answer the question in their own heads, which is a little bit different than simply just listening to something. So it's stimulating activity in their brains. You can use videos. Props are great things to use in a presentation that can short circuit a whole need for a description. So don't be afraid to use props, but be aware that there can be a bit of distraction as well. If you're passing them around, people can end up stopping listening to you. Demos are great. One of my favourite examples of a really beautiful demonstration is the iPhone launch back in 2007. Rachel, thank you, Rach, has already pasted the link to that. Steve Jobs. It's a great talk in a number of different ways, actually. You'll see some of the techniques that I'm going to go on to talk about in a second. But it's a beautiful demonstration. His passion, more than anything, comes across. You really feel his passion and get caught up in it. It's a really interesting talk. It's also a reminder that it was only 10 years ago that the smartphone or the iPhone really changed the way that we look at smartphones and how quickly that technology is changing. So rhetoric is the last thing that I want to talk about, and actually I want to spend some time talking about rhetoric because I think it's a really interesting thing. Rhetoric is defined as the theory and practice of eloquence. It's a nice word, eloquence. Whether it's spoken or written, obviously spoken is the relevant fact for us today. And it's this idea of using the language. And it's using language to persuade or inspire or motivate. And can language really do that? And hopefully later on we'll show you how powerful, just how powerful words can be when they're used in the right way by using a couple of speeches that a couple of my favourites and very well-known speeches. A lot of your comments in the chat box a moment ago were around some of these ideas. Stories are great. I use those all the time when I'm running training workshops. I did today with my friend Bostonis. You can use examples or incidents, little stories. I've told a little story about my friend at the beginning saying he could never do that. Comparisons and contrasts, that's the whole Nancy Duarte idea, but we'll come back to that in a minute when we look at these speeches. Quotes, I've used a couple of those already. Rhetorical questions, I've mentioned already. Humour, definitely something to use in a presentation or a speech. And by the way, humour, it doesn't have to be guffaw laughing humour. You know, we're not comedians, but just light comments. The trick with humour is make a joke, but don't pause for laughter. If you pause for laughter and there's just silence, it's all very awkward. So make a little bit of a joke, a light-hearted comment, maybe give a little, I don't know, cheeky look, poorly phrased, but give a little bit of eye contact to show that you know that it wasn't a very good joke, and keep going. It can just lighten the atmosphere a little bit. But wordplay is what I want to focus on for the next part, and in particular, this idea of repetition. Yeah, it can be really awkward. The key with a joke is to make it light. I mean, I think best man speeches, I think that's the most pressurized kind of talk you can give, because you're expected to be funny. And as I said, we're not comedians. And so, you know, that pressure to be funny really makes us nervous. So if you're going to use humour, don't put pressure on yourself by expecting belly laughs from the audience. That's not going to help your nerves. It's not going to help and it's also going to make it awkward for the audience if it doesn't work. So, metaphors, similes, alliteration, words, and repeating words or phrases and puns. And I just want to illustrate this by looking at a couple of famous speeches. I'm just going to let you read a couple of extracts from this and then pull out some thoughts from that. So, ready to read? Well, this is the first part. This is one of his most famous speeches. No, Siobhan, I didn't. Okay. As you're reading, I'm going to start talking. What I want you to start noticing here is Churchill's teeing up a big contrast. He's talking about something that didn't happen. He's talking about something that he feared might happen and that seemed might happen. And he's then going on to describe a catastrophe in terms of a military disaster. And he goes on. I read one a really nice critique of this speech. Critique sounds as if he didn't like it. He did. He loved the speech. And he said he was troweling it on here. Hard and heavy tidings. And he then develops the idea again, goes on to say about the whole root and core of the army looked like it was going to be lost or captured. But actually it didn't happen. There's a bit of gap in the speech. There's a bit more speech in between the third and fourth paragraph there. And he suddenly says, the scene has cleared, crash and thunder has for the moment, but only for the moment, and a miracle of deliverance. So you can see this Nancy Duarte structure where you're painting this dismal, grim picture. And this is an interesting example of it because it's not where we are and where we're going. This is what could have happened versus what actually happened, which is, it takes skill to make that work, but obviously it works incredibly well in this speech. The other thing to notice here is that he changes to the present tense for the good news. Kathleen both needed to multitask. The good news, when he's talking about what's happened and what actually happened, he uses the present tense. Suddenly the scene is cleared. So it's about this comparison between what could have gone wrong versus what went wrong. So a really good example of a contrast, but a contrast between something that could have happened versus what actually happened. So moving on to the end of this speech, which is the best known part of the speech, I'm going to leave you to read this in silence this time, and I want you to notice, just type in the chat box, what techniques you notice him use in this part of the speech. Yeah, it's pretty obvious, right? Repetition, 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 over and over and over again. And you think if you repeat yourself too much in a presentation, it will sound stupid, but actually it doesn't. What somebody wrote passion, and I'm sorry I missed this past who it was, but it's absolutely, the passion is transmitted by the repetition and this fight and defend, and it's just repeating, 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 and finishing with this shall never surrender. We shall fight, we shall fight, we shall fight. Yeah, rule of three, Thomas, and I think somebody else wrote that as well that is past. The rule of three is this idea that if you have short little patterns of three, often words, they're very memorable. We're saying we came, we saw, we conquered, vini vidi vici, stop, look, listen. There's lots and lots of examples of the power of three, this little pattern of three words, or it can be two or three words in the three, so to speak, that will leave a memorable message for the audience. The key here is repetition from Churchill. Okay, let's develop this a little bit by looking at another of my favourite speeches. This one is probably the most famous speech, but we're not actually going to look at the I Have a Dream part. We're going to look at two different parts of that I Have a Dream speech. This is a bit of a long piece, so I'm going to leave you again in peace to read this section. And just again, type your thoughts as to what you see in the chat box. Great stuff. Seeing some great comments in the chat box here. Just very conscious of time as well, so apologies you haven't quite finished. But in dealing with some of your questions we went along, I'm a bit behind. So yeah, loads of metaphor, analogies, similes. There's a red thread in the metaphors as well. I can just highlight some of this. In red, you'll see this theme about cashing a check. So we've got the metaphor of cashing a check and signing a promissory note and defaulting on the promissory note, the bad check, the insufficient funds, the bank of justice is bankrupt. So it's this repeated, they're all metaphors and similes, but they're all along a common theme. And when you think about the audience here, the audience are some of the poorest people in the nation. and so they're very familiar with a lack of money and getting checks that bounce. So this is particularly pertinent to them. And that's a good way to think when you're looking for a pattern in a speech or a pattern of metaphors. You can look for some metaphors. I'm going to really skip this next part because we're a little bit behind. Same thing again in this part of the speech. So you can see in red, this is repetition, like in Churchill. He talks about the fierce urgency of now and then continued with now is the time. Now, fierce urgency of now plants this seed, and then the repetition of the fierce urgency of now just emphasizes how important it is and how urgent this thing is. I'm finishing in the urgency of the moment. In blue, you can see another series of metaphors, which again, if you look at the rest of this speech, the pattern is continued throughout of climate, and a lot of people are from the deep south, so it's hot in the deep south of the US. And there's also lots of metaphors around geographical features, dark and desolate valleys, quicksands, sweltering summers and invigorating autumns. You can see how how these patterns continue. So use metaphors and use patterns of metaphors in your presentations. Now, just on that point, along with metaphors and repetition and red threads, he also uses quotes, and particularly from spiritual songs, and again, making it relevant to the audience is the important part here. So how do we use this? I'm imagining that, I don't know how many of you are planning to make a speech that rouses a nation, probably less than half. But how do we use these kind of techniques in a presentation, in a technical presentation? We can't use those same kinds of passions. I want you to imagine a project budget review, and you get delivering a presentation that talks about how this project that you've been undertaking in the organisation to review these budget overruns in the project. You can't use that same colour of language. It's too much. What you can do, perhaps, is use a slightly more appropriate red thread of health. We're considering the health of our own projects. We might want to, if we're considering the budgets of our projects and the fact that we keep overrunning on projects, that's comparable to health. And we can use these kinds of phrases about diagnosing problems, about performing post-mortems, etc., etc. So it's scaling down the volume of the metaphors to the topic that you have. Yeah, why not, Siobhan? I agree. You can't. It's also, I mean, you need to tailor the metaphors to the audience. That's what I'm saying, really. But you can use metaphors in any context. So I've overrun by a minute. I apologise for that. Just to review what we've talked about and go over what we've covered. Structure, this sandwich structure, broken up into major and minor points. And in addition to that, this Nancy Duarte idea of comparing now with the future. The importance of making the presentation flow, using sequencing, using transitions, signposting. When you're considering delivery, make sure that you practice, get some feedback, identify your tics and habits. And then latterly, we've been talking about rhetoric and how you add interest and colour to the presentation by using rhetoric and some of those techniques. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening. I apologise for overrunning for a couple of minutes. Please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. I will stay on in order to do that. But we are done. Thank you very much indeed.
Andy?
Hi, Rob.
Just going back on some of the things I picked up, Ken asked a question that might be relevant to the guys. It says, what if you have to deliver a presentation you are not passionate about, i.e. one that you have where you have no choice to do it? What advice?
Yeah. So first of all, as always, practice. Become familiar with the topic, and either find something to be passionate about or fake it. Pretend you're passionate. The old phrase, fake it to make it. Actually believing that you're passionate about something will actually help you to feel a little bit more passionate about it. It's the same with a lot of technical presentations, that there's not so much to be passionate about often. That project budget review presentation example that I was giving a moment ago, it doesn't sound like a really exciting topic, but again, being passionate about something within that can help. So fake it is my short answer to that. Kamesh, I've just noticed one of your question. Make a comeback to the presentation when we make a mistake. Making mistakes, usually it's a bit like an actor in a play. Actors in plays will often get their lines wrong, and the audience will never know. You just continue. If you forget a word or a small idea from the presentation, generally speaking, it's better just to continue with it. If you forget something fundamental, for me, just talk about it. Say, I forgot, I must mention, and just go back and reintroduce it and then continue from where you were. So remember that the audience doesn't know what you're going to say, so if you don't say it, they don't know you've missed it. Johnny, yes, I do have a lot of thoughts about that, and it's a bit of a difficult one for me today. So Johnny's question was, do you have any thoughts about taking questions throughout versus taking at the end? How would you deflect disruptive questions? So taking the first part, taking questions during is my preference, simply because it increases audience interaction. Again, depending on the size of the audience, I'm assuming a presentation rather than a speech here. The downside of that is that you lose control over time to some extent, which I've ably demonstrated today by dealing with some of the questions I got a little bit late. So there are advantages and disadvantages. I would say the more confident you are, the more I would encourage you to take questions as you go. Disruptive questions, the key with that, if you mean by disruptive, almost aggressive, is not to respond aggressively. I would flag a person's right to have their own opinion, and the fact that you don't have that you hold a different opinion, that kind of approach. But really try hard not to appear defensive, which is tough. Funnily enough, I was at a wedding on Saturday, Alexander, and the bride's father did a fantastic job. I'm not looking forward to it when it's my job, because I will just spend the entire time in floods of tears, which I don't know how well that will go down. But that is another top tip. Don't cry while you're presenting. Just seeing if I can go back. Rob, did you see any more questions that you wanted me to answer? Anyone else got any questions?
There was one about, let me find it, 100% presenting 100% technical presentation to 100% non-technical audience.
Yeah, there's a TED talk on this. I think it's called Talk Nerdy to Me, something like that. It's quite an interesting take on a non-technical, talk nerdy to me. The principle of this is somebody who's a non-technical person encouraging people to talk to her about technical ideas in their own terms. The simple answer to the question, which is not a simple question, is you have to talk to people in their language, in a language that they understand. So going back to what Einstein said, you need to really understand your technical information so well that you're able to transmit the ideas to a non-technical audience. Remember in that if they're a non-technical audience, they're not going to actually have to do it. So they only have to understand sort of the broad meanings of things rather than the technical detail, which does simplify your task a little bit, but it is always a challenge. It is always a challenge. Good. I can see people dropping off, which is, when I say dropping off, I hope not actually falling asleep. I mean, logging off. I hope those of you that are still here have enjoyed today. If you've got any more questions, please. Exactly, Philip. Oh, hang on a minute. Kathleen, audience don't know the content of the presentation as the presenter, so you don't have to do it. Yes, exactly. Exactly, Kathleen, I agree with that. It's particularly when you're behind in your timings. It is a tough balance. You need to give. You can absolutely wing it, but you have to give the audience time to absorb. Absolutely. And actually, by the way, I broke one of the golden rules of presenting. You should never put that much text on a slide. I think you're referring to the speech slides. Less text is better on slides, more pictures and short sentences. Good stuff. No more questions I can see. Good. Thanks everybody. I just read your name, Matt Walker, as Matt Webber, which gave me a shock. I thought my son was online. Thanks guys. It's been really interesting. Thanks for all your participation, and hopefully see you again on another webinar soon. Rob.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, everyone, for your participation today. We got the polls and the feedback and the questions. The link was for the slides was posted by Rachel in the chat box. If you've missed that, scroll back up, you can find it. Otherwise, you'll be able to find access to all the webinars on the IMechE website on the training tab. And if you scroll down to the bottom of the training page, there is a free webinar section. Click on that, it lists all those out. And thank you to Andy, thank you to everyone who helped, and hope you have a good rest of the day, and goodbye.